So I now have the task of introducing our guest speaker today. Dr. Dorinda J. Carter Andrews is an associate professor at Michigan State University. You have seen and read all of her academic achievements on your agenda for today. She is a nationally renowned leader in educational equity. From what I've heard of her, and from our conversations together, I recognize why her personal narrative around this work is so important. She is a Southern girl from Georgia, and certain things happen in the South. One of them is that there are people in your house and in your community that encourage you about your education. And to the extent that that is a part of her narrative, I think that has become the basis of the drive for her work and in the direction that she is pointing the rest of us that we need to go. And I would urge you, as you listen to her, to consider your own personal narrative. What is your story around this issue? To the extent that you can relate it to people, we can build coalition, and I hope we'll begin doing some of that work today. Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Dorinda J. Carter Andrews to come and address us?
Thank you. Good morning. Oh, y'all can do better than that. Good morning. Good morning. All right. This is an exciting time whenever people can come together to talk about student achievement and when students are in the room. Because too often we talk about what we need to do for them and we don't have them at the table. So I'm so excited that we have young people in the room and that we're going to be able to hear their voices in a little while. I thank you for having me. It's a privilege, it's an honor. I'm missing gymnastics practice, I'm missing piano, but my kids have a good dad that's making sure they get to all those places. So for all the dads in the house, do what you do when mommy has to go do other stuff. I have titled my remarks, I'm going to try to be obedient and stay within my time limit because I know that there's work for you all to do. And so I have prepared my remarks really to raise your consciousness, to go into the work that you're going to do this morning and this afternoon, and to share some strategies. As I've listened to what has already been said, you are already doing some of the things that I'm going to mention, and that is to be commended. But as the PowerPoint shows, Black achievement matters. I mean, we're in a national context right now where the Black Lives Movement, the Say Her Name movement, these movements are ripe and timely, and they're so interconnected to what's happening in schools. And so I've been intentional by saying Black achievement matters. We could say all achievement matters, and it does, but everybody is not in the bottom portion of the gaps. And so it is important that we do develop a common agenda for Black student success. I want to start with a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. that says, "No work is insignificant. All labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence." What you are doing, what you have been doing for 3 years is not insignificant, but excellence is hard to achieve. And so I want to encourage you to just keep pressing forward, keep moving. Sometimes it'll feel like you're taking one step forward and 2 steps back in the journey. But we have to keep pressing if we're going to eliminate access and opportunity gaps. And so we can't just do what is necessary, we have to do what is necessary and sufficient. And sometimes we miss the mark by simply focusing on what is necessary, providing those basic needs for young people, but it is often insufficient. So let me move forward first by starting on a positive note. Our young people are eagles. One of the things my late mother often told us as children was that we were eagles. and that we could fly above the storm. And so in an atmosphere where there's so much negativity about Black student performance, we have to celebrate the academic resilience, the personal resilience that these young people have, because they are trying to fly in a context where there are so many barriers. So I just wanted us to remember that these young children are eagles. Many of them fly above the storm, they fly through the storm. And we as the adults have to be the people that help them do that. I would be remiss if we did not pause for those we have lost. And these are just a few, but they remind us of the systemic treatment, outcomes, and portrayals that key systems like education, the criminal justice system, the labor force enact to create and perpetuate disproportionality for our youth. And so as a result, we've lost Renisha McBride, Tamir Rice, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Jordan Davis, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Tanisha Anderson, Shelley Frey, Rakia Boyd, and so many others. These were young people in our schools that we have lost. And we have to say that this cannot continue. There is a crisis in Black education, but the crisis is not about the kids, it's about the structures and systems that work to keep them undermined within the system. So I want you to think about the language you use today, because language is powerful. Our kids are not at risk. They are with promise. Our kids are not underprivileged. They are disadvantaged and marginalized. How we frame the problem impacts the types of alternatives and strategies that we come up with. They are not minority youth. They are minoritized youth. They are people of color. So we have to think about the language we use as we address these problems. So why focus on Black student school experiences? Because I don't want to assume that everybody in here is not consumed with the all lives and all achievement matters mantra. Well, we know that Black kids are over-policed and underprotected in our schools. We know this. They are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. In fact, a recent report from the Schott Foundation shows that our boys are 3 times more likely than white males to be suspended. And we can't just stay focused on the Black male narrative, because African American girls are the fastest growing population in the school to prison pipeline. In fact, Black females are 6 times more likely than white females to be suspended. Racial inequities are evident in various aspects of our educational system. And so we can't say race doesn't matter. We're much more comfortable identifying these gaps as class gaps, as socioeconomic gaps. But race and class are so intricately connected in our society that even when we hold socioeconomic status constant, right, with middle class and upper class families, we still see racial gaps. We cannot say there's something deficit about those families. We have to say, maybe there's something about the institutions and structures in which they're living and operating. So as you're working today, I want you to understand that the outcome is to maximize Black student success, but we have to take a step back and look at systems and structures in order to do that, and stop saying the families, the kids, the community. We also need to focus on Black students' school experiences because we know the graduation gap between Black and white males has widened, increasing from 19 percentage points in 09-10 to 21 percentage points in 12-13. We also know that our children are less likely to be enrolled in AP courses and gifted and talented programming. These are national crises that mirror themselves in school districts across the country. And we also know that our children are more likely to be classified as students with disabilities, and specifically in the categories of intellectual disability and emotionally behavioral disorder. Okay, Black students are overrepresented in those categories. One of the things I want you to understand about that is that the over-reliance on teacher referrals to initiate these assessment processes is the major contributor to the disproportionality. So teachers are referring incorrectly to special education and not referring enough to gifted and talented programming. This is rooted in a lack of cultural understanding and dominant hegemonic norms about who is gifted, what is giftedness, without a true understanding of the variety of gifts that young people can have. That giftedness does not have to look one way. And so our teachers need to be educated on how to identify what we consider giftedness and how they're missing the mark in noticing that in African American children. The other thing I want you to take away about this statistic is that these are judgment categories, right? ID and EBD. So they are not verifiable biological categories. In special education, we have disabilities that are rooted in biological differences, and the others are rooted in socially constructed differences. We see our children overrepresented in the categories that are very judgment-based and not scientifically based. So again, that leads us to think about what kind of training do educators need to understand cultural nuances in behavior. That may not be about, you need to be in special education, that teacher needs to just better understand how to manage his or her classroom. I do want to applaud Montgomery County because the Shop Foundation, using national data, you all are the highest ranking district in the country for graduating, particularly Black males. And you should be applauded. You should, right? You should. At the same time, 69% is inadequate. Where are the other 31% of those Black males, right? So there is work to be done. It is good, but it's insufficient. It's insufficient because that's a 20% percentage gap with white males, and that was a few years ago. Right? So we can applaud that 69%, but it needs to be at the 89% for white males and higher. So why do we have these gaps? There's a continuum that education runs on, right? And we often will locate the problems in individuals and their choices and their sense of agency and motivation. But again, I want to encourage you today to think about the other side of the spectrum. What are the systems, structures, and cultural considerations that are not being talked about when we think about these gaps? So one of the things I would say is that we have a consciousness gap in education that then impacts the access and opportunity gaps. Even when we use the language achievement gap, we're locating the problem on the kids, right? Kids don't control their access to opportunities. Adults do. So then we have to reframe how we're talking about academic underperformance. We have to reframe it. That's not to say young people don't play a role in their own achievement, but so do system structures and cultural considerations. And so if we're going to close academic and opportunity gaps, we have to close the consciousness gap. So that leads me to a couple of assumptions that I want you to take into your breakouts. The first assumption is that educational inequity is rooted in historical, political, economical, and moral ideologies and positions that have resulted in racial and socioeconomic inequities. These didn't just arrive 10, 15 years ago. Public schooling was never designed for all the young people that we educate now. So when we talk about an achievement gap, we're really talking about an education debt that the country owes to African Americans, because the system was never designed for us in the first place. So I'm trying to raise your consciousness. You've got to go into your discussions with this first assumption. It was never equal. So you're working on a problem that's hundreds of years old, okay? Again, this is why they are access and opportunity gaps that then result in academic underperformance. Black people never had equal access to the same type of schooling. So you've got to understand that as assumption one. Let me give you another way of looking at that, and that's a little small, but if we think about the major social identity categories in the US, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc., we have to think about who holds the power for each of those identity groups in the US, okay? If we think about race, it's whites. If we think about class, it's the upper class. If we think about gender, it's men. Sexual orientation, it's heterosexuals. Religion, it's Christians. Ability, it's able-bodied people. Language, it's native English speakers, and I would say native standard English speakers, because a lot of us speak English as our first language, but we speak it in a lot of ways. And the power comes in understanding academic English. So then when we think about those dominant markers, we have to think about all of our institutions in the US and who has controlling power to create the cultural norms for those institutions. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, it's white, upper class, heterosexual, Christian men who are able-bodied and speak the language of power. That doesn't make them bad men, right? But instead of talking so much about people's disadvantage, we need to talk about the privilege of those who create the policies and cultural norms for our systems and have them examine that privilege and say, am I using my privilege in ways that are helpful or harmful to the educational outcome of all children? So, newsflash, schools operate under and promote these dominant cultural codes. So we have to think, in our country, schools are inherently racialized, classed, gendered, heterosexist, and homophobic spaces. If we buy into that assumption, then we understand there are many Black children coming to school that don't know the codes. They're not practiced in their communities. They're not practiced in their homes. That doesn't make them deficient or deviant. It makes them different, right? So it's our job as educators, community members, et cetera, to teach these kids the codes of power. Not so they can continue to perpetuate the oppression, but to challenge it and change it. But if you don't know the codes to begin with, you can't question them, right? So we have to understand this assumption. The second one is that equity and equality don't mean the same thing. Now that's nice that y'all talking about equity, but I want to make sure people understand what equity really is. Let's look at this depiction here. Some of you may be familiar with this, right? We assume that if we provide the same resources to all the kids, they'll just meet the benchmarks. That's not how it happens, because all kids don't have the same starting point. They're entering your schools with different assets, different disadvantages. So we can't just say, well, I gave them all a box. Because some kids are more privileged. The tall kid can't control that he's taller, but he doesn't need a box to see the game. He can see it without the box, right? But then you have those privileged families who will say, well, why you take my kid's box away? Because he didn't need it. He didn't need it. And you all are in a resource-rich county and community. So you have to help families and even teachers understand that giving the same does not lead to equitable outcomes. It just doesn't. And it's because kids are coming with unique differences and varying levels of resources. I want to remind you again, even when we hold socioeconomic status constant, we still have kids by racial group who need different resources. So while equity is about equality is about sameness, equity is about what's fair and what's just. And so we're gonna have to differentiate to get to just outcomes for Black youth. We have to level the playing field first to then create access and opportunity. Let me get to the third assumption. I'm trying to talk fast. The third assumption is that meritocracy is a myth. Can we please stop telling young people that if you just work hard and put forth effort, you're gonna get your piece of the American pie? That works for some young people who come to school already knowing the codes, or who have privilege based on some of their identity markers. For many Black youth, that formula is not enough, right? Hard work, individual effort, that's that grit narrative. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't say that, but it's insufficient to only say that. For many young people of color, it's hard work, individual effort, and overcoming some barriers that are in society. They didn't create the barriers for themselves, right? But if we give them this false sense that there are no barriers out there, we are doing them a disservice, right? So these visuals show us some people, and again, if we look at racial inequity, there are many whites, because of white privilege, who are able to not have to stand in the line. They just can walk in the gate because of race privilege. The women and the people of color are standing in line, right? The picture at the bottom says, for a fair selection, everybody has to do the same exam, climb the tree. Now, those are different types of animals. They've got different types of assets. The elephant is too big to climb the tree. Do you see what I'm trying to go with this analogy? We just say do the task and assume that all young people can do the same task, and we don't pay attention to their unique differences. Let's look at the bootstraps metaphor as another way to understand this, to raise our consciousness. Some young people come to school with boots that are nicely laced, they're brand new, they're shiny, they know those cultural codes for how to do school, right? They've got the capital. There are other kids that come to school with boots, but they're a bit worn, they're raggedy. The laces aren't so nice and neat. Then we have young people who come to school, maybe one of their boots doesn't have any laces, or maybe one lace. And we have young people in this district and all around the country that come to school with no boots at all. And yet and still we say, do the same task, right? There are many African American children represented in each of those categories. Ultimately, we want all kids to have nicely shined, laced up boots, ready to go and to perform highly at school. But the reality is they all don't. And so we as the adults have to think about, what do we have to do to level the playing field for those young people? So as I come to the last few pieces, I say we have to take a look in the mirror at ourselves. What are your lenses? How are you examining the education gap for Black students, right? You are seeing the issue through a certain set of lenses. You have a race, a language, a social class, an age, a gender. All of that, who you are, shapes the way you view the problem and how you talk about solutions for the problem. So you can't negate who you are in the process. There are a lot of factors that contribute to access and opportunity gaps for African American students. Yes, there are environmental conditions. There are policies and procedures, but within school, there's a lack of cultural understanding, deficit orientations about African American students, and colorblind and culture blind ideology. Let me say a little bit about what I'm talking about. That lack of cultural understanding. We hear people say those students need to adapt and assimilate into the culture of my classroom, my building, and accept the consequences if they don't. Why would we want young people to assimilate? Assimilate means to become like something I'm not. We want them to adapt to school. Learning the codes of school is just another set of codes in their backpack. But too often we say, be like something you're not. The deficit orientations around lowered expectations. Well, they lack so much in their home environments that it makes it difficult for me to teach them. That's a deficit perspective that we have to reframe. And the colorblind ideology is about saying, I treat all kids the same. I don't see color. Well, when you don't see my color, you are not seeing an aspect of who I am. Color blindness is not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for African American children, because our racial history is one of perseverance, of struggle, of overcoming, and when you say you don't see that, you negate those successes in my background. So let me move forward to these final slides around what can we do, right? And who needs to do it? Well, we all need to do it. It's a multifaceted approach to Black student success. It takes teachers, administrators, policymakers, and community members and organizations. We are all educators, all of you, whatever hat you're wearing. And so you all need to be asking yourself these three questions. How does my identity inform or shape my practices, my beliefs about teaching and learning? And how do I know what I don't know? In what areas do I need to learn more about culture, privilege, power, and difference? We talk about race, but we don't talk about it strategically. You can't have a dialogue about race if you're not going to talk about white privilege and white supremacy, because we all live under the system, right? That's not saying white people are racist. It's saying we're all affected by the system, and so we can't talk about racism and not talk about the system under which it was created and how it affects schooling. And how might I be a more critically race-conscious educator? So I'm going to provide these slides to Mr. Warner, but here you can't see these. I would refer what works at the classroom level. We know that Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about culturally relevant pedagogy. Look at her book, The Dream Keepers. teachers who are successful with African American children. We know Geneva Gay talks about culturally responsive teaching, okay? And Christine Sleeter, who is a white ally, talks about critical multicultural teaching. These are pedagogies and practices that work. The research has shown that they work. At the building level, what works? Administrators should consider creating equity teams in the building, right? Every school in this district ought to have an equity team. And there's research about how you construct those, what those look like, and what their charge is. And there ought to be clear equity goals in school improvement plans. It shouldn't be embedded and hidden. It should be explicit. There needs to be implementation of culturally responsive discipline interventions. Are you using restorative justice practices and culturally responsive positive behavior intervention supports? There are PBIS programs that are not culturally responsive. So you've got to identify the ones that are culturally relevant and responsive. And we have to have quality, sustained professional development focused on building teachers' cultural competency, again, as it relates to race, power, and whiteness. And districts have to invest in this. And building leaders can engage their staff in cultural assessment at the individual and organizational level. What can policymakers do? You ought to have a district level equity team. Now, this is a large district, so you may need more than one of those, but there should be a district level equity team. You have to look at policies and procedures for how we determine who gets to take AP courses. Structural racism occurs because we have policies that on the surface look really good, but when they're implemented, they disproportionately negatively affect certain groups of kids. Also, the professional development. I heard you all talk about high quality early education, and we have to have wraparound services as well. As I think about what works at the district level, I just read this in the newspaper yesterday. This superintendent in Minneapolis said, no kid will be suspended unless I see the referral. Wow, that's radical. We will not suspend any, all referrals will come across my desk. Now that's a way to try to get a handle on suspensions and expulsions in that district. At the community level, what works? We have to have mentoring programs, quality after-school programming. Let me tell you, I'm in a lot of after-school programs and they're not quality. They have to be really structured around literacy and math, the fundamental skills where our kids struggle. They can't just be running around playing basketball, okay? So community people work with these schools to really get quality after-school programming going. We have to engage parents better. And we have, even community organizations have to have those wraparound services. So I have like 1 minute, and I'm going to fast forward and say there's a danger in silence. We cannot be silent, y'all. There are too many single stories about Black youth, but they have such multiplicative identities that are rich, right? Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. It's not enough to be talking about race and racism and structural racism and cultural proficiency. What are we going to do that's different? But it starts with you. We stand on the shoulders of many Black educators who have already done the work. W.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, Booker T. Washington, Marva Collins, Marion Wright Edelman, and Lisa Delpit. Marion Wright Edelman said, you're not obligated to win, you're obligated to keep trying to do the best you can every day. And that's what I want to leave you with. Keep doing the best you can to eliminate access and opportunity gaps. As I close, I want you to say this with me. I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something I can't do. But I will do what I can. Edward Everett Hale said that. I want you to do what you can because there's so much to be done for Black youth. Thank you.
I got